Hello, everyone. Welcome to another weekly webinar, or recurring webinar, I should say. As usual, for the people who've been joining in, we will take a few minutes for the rest to give them some time to join in, people who signed up but haven't joined in yet. So we'll just go off, unmute ourselves and go off stage for a few minutes, and we'll be back in maybe 2 to 3 minutes to start over. Okay, welcome guys to our recurring webinar series. I'll get Carmen to come on stage. As some of you know who've been part of these webinar series, we've been offering these webinars during the COVID-19 period on topics which are selected to help build awareness of improvement methodologies and tools that we've used in past. Today's topic is on integrated process management. And at ANI, we utilize a toolbox approach to any improvement situation. If a problem exists, we'll use a specific tool to solve that problem, and we try not to fit a tool to a problem, but the other way around. Today's topic is about such a tool designed to help institutionalize process standards, measure performance against those standards, and manage performance to meet those standards. Carmen has been part of executing this approach, and he's going to help us understand it today. A bit about him, if you don't know him, he's a founding member of Analyze and Improve, and he's one of the senior partners in the organization. He's been involved in continuous improvement for over 25 years and have global experience working directly in operations, technical, and corporate environments. He's a master black belt in Lean Six Sigma. Before I hand over the stage to him, a little bit on the structure of our talk. We'll start with the presentation on this topic. While presentations are occurring, you can ask any questions that you may have in the questions tab on the right side of your screen. Carmen and I will keep an eye on those questions, and then we'll try to answer them at the end. We'll also have an opportunity to talk face-to-face and discuss any further questions or interesting points through a Google Meet session after the webinar has ended. A link is present in the chat window for you to attend if you want to be part of that social discussion. Before I hand the stage back to Carmen, I did want to say that this is going to be one of our last ones for a while. As I said, we had picked these webinars to cover some topics while we were at home and kind of grounded during the COVID times. And as things are starting to get back picked up and getting normal, we'll try to schedule them when we have some time. So for now, we're just going to stop the recurring piece and maybe pick them as required or when we have some time. Okay, Carmen, I'll hand the stage to you, and we'll come back on once you're done.
Very good. Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone who are joining in this morning and for taking part in this topic of integrated process management. I'll just briefly say a few words, and then we'll get going with the actual video and the webinar. It's this approach, for those of you who haven't seen it or heard of it, is as close as you're going to get to the idea of having very clear steps and a blueprint for how to drive improvement. It's one of the complaints that a lot of people have when they enter the journey of operational improvement or continuous improvement, that they seem to be disjointed tools at times or disjointed approaches. And the author of this approach, integrated process management, actually lays out a series of steps and the theories and the practicality of each of the steps. So it's as close as you're going to get to this blueprint approach. And as the author puts it in his words, it's an obsession to satisfying customers. It's an obsession to satisfying the downstream process. And if you believe that that's important, and you believe that you need the discipline to do this well, then this is where this approach kicks in. So enjoy the video, and we'll be able to answer your questions that you text here on the side. And yeah, we'll talk at the end of the webinar. Thank you. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Today's topic is integrated process management, or IPM, captured in this fantastic book by Roger Slater. So before we get into IPM, or the 6 steps that are commonly referred to in the book, let's take a look at something that everyone already knows about, a franchise or a company that exists across the world, such as a Tim Hortons, a Starbucks, a McDonald's, or something to that nature. And what you do is, by thinking of one of these businesses, you can ask either yourself or your group to think about how did they ensure quality, low variability, and profitability at all of their worldwide locations? How do they ensure that a McDonald's in China operates the same way as a McDonald's in Canada, for instance? And what's nice is, without having to go through integrated process management, you can engage people in just thinking through those steps. And this is a real example. For instance, one person would come up and say, well, they normally have standard ways of creating their product. So their product could be coffee or hamburgers. And they also have a standard look of their shop, whatever the case may be. Someone else would say they need to set up a culture and environment for what to expect in their stores. So when you go into a Starbucks, it has a certain feel to it, regardless of where you are. Another comment would be making sure everyone's actually following those standard ways and providing feedback to those people so they know that they're doing it correctly or incorrectly. Making sure everyone's trained and the standards are known, of course, that would be a big part of making sure that we have a certain feel across the different stores across the world. You would also need to understand the process of making good food and drinks, and defining those input quality measures would be an important part. And finally, a way to analyze if we're not performing well and how to improve the process. So the nice way is by thinking through an example of a company that is known or a franchise that is known, these kind of bullets would come up. And obviously they would come in a different sequence, but then by putting them in a very specific sequence, they would match up very well with what we're trying to teach with integrated process management. So the 6 steps are, as you see on the right-hand side, creating the environment, developing the process, identifying key variables would be number 2. Number 3 is developing control standards. Number 4 is communicating those standards. Number 5 is monitoring the effectiveness of those standards. And finally, analyze the process. Let's look at each one at a time. Creating the environment. So the theory behind here is things like positive enforcement. There's a lot of education and training that goes into this area. Why is it important? Well, obviously the material has to be applicable and reinforced. So whatever the philosophy and whatever we're trying to do as a company has to be understood. You may get the training, but there's a big difference between attending the training and actually understanding what the purpose is, right? So how can this step fail? This step can fail if people get the training, but they don't really understand what integrated process management really is, what the spirit of what we're trying to do. Number 2, develop the process and identify key variables. So the theory here is we're trying to understand what the process is. So if we have a process of making coffee or of making different types of foods, we need to know what that process looks like. What's the output? So the output could be the final product. But more importantly, what are the inputs? What are all the different things and controls I need to do so that I get the final product that I'm looking for at the very end? So in the end, we're trying to understand the processes, the outputs and the inputs. How it can fail? It can fail if we have too many outputs and inputs and we're not really understanding which the critical ones are. So that could be a problem. And you can also have failure if you incorrectly identify the inputs. They are not the correct inputs to drive the output that you're looking for. Number 3, develop control standards. So this has to do with what you want to control, who is responsible, how does it affect the customer, how is it measured, who records the data, and there is a list of questions that I'll show in a couple of seconds. Why is it important? Because once you agree on what the outputs and the inputs are, you need to set a standard for that critical input. You need to have a standard way of doing the activity and doing the action. Okay? And then that control standard is really the only way to ensure it's done properly. It's locked in, pretty much. How it can fail? One way it fails is people are in a rush and they're just creating a standard for the sake of creating a standard, that it doesn't really have value, it doesn't really have quality to it. Or if people don't believe that it's actually needed, is another way that this step can fail. Here's a list of questions that the author, you can find it in his book, but it's summarized here in the slide. It's a really good list. If you are in the process of creating standards, it helps you go through some of the questions that you need to ask yourself and to answer in order to develop a very good standard. We need to also communicate those control standards. It's one thing to develop them. It's another thing to actually communicate them to all the people who need to know them. So the theory behind it is specialized training, communication, handbooks, mistake proofing, anything to do with communicating the standard back to the people who need them. So why is it important? Obviously, the idea here is you're converting this document or this standard into usable info. It provides frontline people with special training and even things like feedback system on conformance to standards. How can it fail? Well, it can fail if this control standard is known and understood by just a few people, perhaps the person who developed it and a few of their closest friends or colleagues, but it will fail if not known by the vast majority or if everyone who is involved with the process. And it also fails if new people don't have an automatic way to know about these standards. So new people coming into an organization sometimes miss out on these critical training sessions or these critical standards. Fifth, monitor effectiveness. Theory here is some kind of conformance and feedback. You can have things like surveys and audits. Essentially, you have evidence that inputs are being controlled. Okay, so what evidence do we have that it's actually happening properly? So why is it important? We often hear this from our workers. No one ever tells me how I'm doing. So if I don't know if I'm doing it well or improperly, then how can I make sure that it's done well continuously? This step is all about feedback. Therefore, how can it fail? It can fail if we think of monitoring as being the same as, quote unquote, being a police officer, right? So people often get very nervous about providing feedback or about monitoring. They think that we're just policing the situation, and it's not the same thing. It's just about making sure the standard is defined, is understood, and that is followed properly. And of course, another way it can fail is, should we monitor the output or the inputs? You can definitely monitor the outputs, but if you're trying to control the situation and control the standard, that's all about the inputs. Finally, analyze and diagnose. The theory here has to do with things like employee recognition, the ability to challenge the standards. They're not locked in forever. They can be challenged if there's a better way of doing it. It's all about continuous improvement. But when the standard exists, there has to be strict conformance. There is the ability to improve it and propose suggestions, but in the moment, you are following the standard exactly as defined. Why is it important? Well, one of the reasons is problems do not get corrected or improved if you don't have the step. And you may find that not all current inputs are truly key. You may have 10, 20, 30 different inputs, but there may only be a handful that are truly critical. And so you need to understand what they are. How can it fail? Well, it can fail if you know there's problems, but we don't take the time to correct them in the system. So we're always in a rush, we're always busy firefighting, and we don't have this step 6 in place to actually have a loop to improve the process. So how to remember the 6 steps? Well, it's not very hard to memorize, especially if you go back and you think of it in terms of an organization that you know very well or that you frequent very well. In this example, something like a coffee shop, a Tim's or Starbucks. And you can see the 6 steps and what it means as a way of remembering. So the environment could be the coffee culture of stepping into a Starbucks, for instance. The key variables or inputs, well, what defines a great cup of coffee? It might have to do with temperature. It may have to also do with the frequency that a fresh batch is made. You need to develop the standards. So how exactly will we do these steps? You need to communicate them. In other words, how will people know? The monitoring phase is who's going to check this. Some of the checks can be done internally. Some could be done by an external person as well. And the last step is analyze, the ability to make changes and improvements. So all in all, what makes IPM work is not just the fact that there's these 6 steps, but the fact that they're all interconnected. So what you can see here is you have the first 4 steps, and then you have a sort of a feedback loop between step 5 and 6 and the first 4. So the last 2 steps offer some kind of a feedback, some kind of information back to the first 4 steps, and it puts it all together in a cohesive manner. So in summary, if IPM is used properly, then you could have situations perhaps that the standards don't exist, or they do exist but not properly set up, or they exist and they're set up but still weren't used properly by people. Well, what's really, really nice is if you have IPM in terms of the full 6 steps, the first 4 and the 2 that do the feedback loop, then any of those situations, any of those scenarios get caught and corrected in step 5 and 6. You may also need some elements of mistake proofing, but they all fit in very nicely together. We often blame mistakes or oversights on, screwing up or laziness or someone not caring. But obviously, or more often than not, it's something else that is a root cause. And one of the root causes is, for instance, not having these 6 steps properly defined, or perhaps a gap in some of those elements so that it doesn't actually hold together as a cohesive system. Thank you for your time.
Okay, I'll wait for Carmen to come back on stage here. In the meantime, I'll see if there's any questions. Hey, Carmen. That was a nice conversation, nice topic there. I don't see any questions on the tab other than the comment that Elka made there.
Yeah, I can just add a few words on that one. If anyone else has any questions, they can type them in. Yeah, Yelka. I mean, for people in the audience, I know there's a mixed group of people with lots of experiences. So many of the systems out there that tend to work have a lot of similar aspects to it. There's this idea of, for instance, not just having the tools or not just having the sections of improvement, but finding a way to actually define them well and connect them well together. And so really, really good frameworks and really, really good systems have that feel to it, that feel that there's things that are interconnected. There's some kind of a loop between them, and there's as much detail and as much information as possible. So obviously, in this specific case, the author took the time to say this is something that he had done back in the 80s and a few of the industries and the steel industry that he worked in, and through time refined it and came up with a system of 6 steps, which are fairly simple. I like anything that can be explained to people without making it overly complicated. And it works. We've applied it to some of the clients who are willing to embark in this journey, and it is fairly straightforward to put in place. So, but yes, it'll have very similar aspects to other systems as well. I see a question by Nathan as well. It's fair to say that doing too good a job of firefighting is actually a hindrance. Yeah, I know what you mean. It's kind of a deep topic. Obviously, we especially for those of you who are calling in from the mining and metallurgical industry, it's a big part of what we do is the whole firefighting aspect. There's a few ways Asim and I have dealt with this in a few different manners, right? So one way is to try and teach people that firefighting is definitely part of what we do. It has to be part of our jobs. It definitely has to be something that we have to be very good at. And sometimes we use kind of a slide to show, well, the left-hand side is definitely about firefighting. So when a house is on fire, the fire department are not analyzing what happened. They're working really, really hard and fast to make sure the fire gets put out. So that goes without saying. But at some point, and this is going to your question, Nathan, is at some point, once that fire is out, there has to be a commitment to saying, right, are we going to try and learn from this, or are we just happy running around with fire hoses and extinguishing fires? And that's part culture, part mentality. I think it's fun to firefight. It builds adrenaline, so we tend to get a lot of enjoyment and almost like a rush to firefight, where improving and finding root causes and eliminating the problem can be considered boring, right? As you do this, it's not very exciting. So yes, that question is fair, and that's why I had to laugh. It's when you have a group of people, when you have a culture in an organization that loves firefighting, it tends to go counter to wanting to actually take an hour, take 30 minutes at the end of an incident, and not just a health and safety incident, but an operational incident or a maintenance incident, and say, do we want to learn? We want to do a bit of root cause analysis and make sure this doesn't happen anymore. So it's a good question. Mike's question: what are some of the practical barriers in applying this you've come up against? Ideas to overcome cultural. Yeah, a couple in terms of personal experience. A couple of things. It's not unique to integrated process management. I see some people who are in this list who have their own experiences from other organizations as well. One hindrance is you got to try and make this simple. It's sometimes we tend to make it overly complicated. We start putting more and more structures and routines and complexities and definitions, and sometimes that can be counterintuitive. I kind of like when they talk about the onion approach, right? You're peeling the onion layers, and when you're teaching this, when you're trying to build engagement in a company or an organization, try and build that first one at the highest level first. So that example I showed at the beginning of the video is a real one that I did with a client. And I said, I'm not even going to talk about integrated process management. Why don't you tell me what makes a successful company or successful franchise? And lo and behold, they come up with the steps without even knowing that they're coming up with the steps. So that's a really good way to break down the barrier where they're saying, oh, this is going to be another complex concept invented by some guy 20 years ago or 30 years ago. But if you can make it real for the people learning it, then they get it very, very quickly, and it removes, and I know I've been told this, is it removes some of the stigma that's attached to having a system in place, the concern or the worry about putting this in place. I think another barrier is, I know Awesome does a lot of work as well when we're teaching, let's say, the lean process or the Six Sigma process, and there's different steps there as well, like the MAIC, define, measure, analyze, improve, control. And that has the same challenges, and that is, if you're going to do it, you have to do the whole thing. You can't do 80% of it or 75% of it. You can't skip define and then skip control and say that, oh, we did it the MAIC project, but it's not working. So the same thing happens with this process is you enter the journey. The first few steps might seem very simple, and then you start getting towards the last few steps, and it's a little bit more challenging because you have a feedback loop. You're trying to improve. You're trying to do, like Nathan's question, where we're trying to stay away from firefighting and actually have an improvement cycle involved. And well, let's not worry about that part. Let's just stick with the main steps, and you'll have a failed approach again, and then you'll blame the approach or you'll blame the system for not working when actually it was because you didn't actually implement the whole thing. So the whole thing has to be done, or otherwise you're just going to get patchy, spotty results and performance. You mentioned cultural, Mike, as well. I mean, that's always an issue. I think, again, from the people who are joining in today, I'm sure everyone has experience with that. Culture is something, it usually fits into the change management aspect. You want to learn what the issues are culturally. If you're rolling this out in a big company, the big company may have sites in North America, South America, Africa. And how you do this and how you teach it and how you put it in place can vary a little bit. And so, yes, that definitely is something, in anything we do has to be a part of language, right? You can't ignore language issues as well when you're rolling this out across a corporation.
Okay. Yeah, I think Nathan is typing there something, so I'll wait for him. But I just wanted to talk about the firefighting and the cultural. I think they're all kind of linked, right? You mentioned people like doing that kind of work. I think that's the biggest thing that I see when I go in a mine or in this environment is people feel valued at the end of the day if they solve a problem, if they put out a fire. And that's the cultural which has to be changed, usually by showing them that there's other stuff which is more valuable, right? And it's a journey, as you said.
Yeah, thanks, Nathan, for your comment. Exactly. It's I was just thinking of another personal experience in terms of things that create problems, and I've had a client that spent more time on creating sort of the IT platform. So that's another problem that we have in the improvement community, is we translate something that's an improvement technique or an approach, and then we spend all our time just building the IT platform, the electronic portal, so to speak, of what you're trying to do. And then in this specific case, all the effort and attention was on the portal, on the windows and screens and the forms. And A, it became overly complicated, and B, we got further and further away from the point of this, which was to follow these very simple 6 steps and make sure people define the standards and follow them. So sometimes that becomes an issue. It's not on purpose, because of course there is a desire to make things automated and electronic as much as possible, but you can have that run away from you and make it counterintuitive, so to speak. Oh, Ken's question, it's like exercise many days, slow improvement, it takes a level of discipline to stick with it. Yeah, that is true. I mean, there's a lot of good analogies, and that's why there is not controversy. Everyone has their own take on how to drive improvement, but I'm all about, doing it in layers and making sure that I say, well, my first step in this journey is to make sure that you as a company, you as a group, you as an organization, at least believe that these 6 steps make sense. Let's not go any deeper. Let's not go any further down before we get into the details. So I get it at that level. And then to Ken's point, once I can build that kind of an engagement, then let's just try and do it. You may not be doing it properly, right? You may not have the quality aspect in there yet, but let's at least have, this idea that we have this process, we're going to define some inputs, we're going to define some standards. So I don't mind if the quality is not there up front. I don't mind if, they didn't do a really good job identifying all the X's, or they didn't do a really good job identifying a proper standard. But it's to Ken's point, it's that routine of saying, I'm getting used to the fact that I want to understand what the output, the input, the standards, and the feedback loop is. Once I have that routine, I'm happy. It's much, much easier to fix. An analogy to Ken's point is if somebody's getting into implementing KPI boards or lean boards or sort of these feedback loop type of boards. Once you have the routine, the rest is a lot easier. So, the routine has to exist, the meetings have to exist, they're looking at the KPIs. Now, maybe the KPIs are incorrect. Maybe the way they question them, the way they solve them is not very good just yet. But if the routine is there, then the discipline is starting to build. And then it's a lot easier to build improvement and get the quality done second. So I do agree with that comment.
Okay. I think that's it for the comments and questions. As I said earlier, we'll have a Google Meet session right after this, so I'll put the link back in there for those who want to join and have a face-to-face conversation. Other than that, I think this is going to be our last recurring webinar for a while. We will reschedule them if time allows and as they're required. Yeah, thank you for attending, and see you soon.
Thank you very much, everyone.